Well, let's keep talking about this area of resistance. All right? The second area of resistance is fleeing. Now, let me just say, and this is challenging because we're going to deal with this. Remember, several layers. A lot of times, the first thing we want to do when adversity comes our way is to get out of Dodge. I understand. I'm the exact same way. The first thing is I don't want this, I don't need this, and I want out. I want out. So I get it, and I understand it, and I'm not saying there aren't moments to do it because, for example, the one they gave in the book, David with Saul. There came a moment that David said, I'm out of this. This is an asylum. This is a loony bin. And this guy's the head loon. And I'm out of here. But listen to there was adversity before what finally took it over the edge. Do you know what the adversity was that took it over the edge, that David finally fled to the caves of Adullam? Do you remember what happened in order that precipitated that event? Spears. Someone starts throwing spears at you. That might be a good time to say, I'm not wanted here, maybe. But that was what it, and he fled to the caves of Adullam. Again, it was a king, and there was no recourse with that king, except to God, who would now have to be his vindicator with regards to that. But fleeing. But I encourage, and I'll just share this. There's a book or two out there, and I'm not going to give you the title to it because I really don't want you to go read it. But now you'll Google it and try to find it because I told you not to look for it. But there are Christians who are wanting to leave the United States because of the adversity that's coming to our nation. And I've been asked about this. Maybe we should start... Some of them, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's my question. And some of those nations that look good at the moment can turn in a heartbeat because I know how they operate.
Especially if they don't have an army.
Well, right, because or internal struggle. There can be internal politics to the thing too. But the point being is that I'm not saying there isn't a moment to flee, but our world is such now. For example, when Puritans and Pilgrims and others faced religious persecution in Europe, there was somewhere to go. There were unexplored lands, uninhabited lands. Now I guess we'd have to go to Antarctica or the North Pole, or I don't know where we go. Some island. I think everything pretty much has been explored and spoken for. And then that would lead you to the next point we'll get to in a moment, and that is armed resistance. But fleeing, while that's always an option, I always tell people, just don't go to that one instantly. I mean, sometimes you need to explore fully number one before you go instantly to number two. And you can apply this personally. You can apply it to, whether it's schools or workplaces or fleeing, while it's appropriate for you to be able to do that and to save yourself, it's not always the thing to do. And then the third recourse is to use force if I can spell, use force. This is what we would call appropriate rebellion. Appropriate rebellion. I want you to listen because I want to make sure you're hearing what's being said here. Rutherford's third recourse demands greater attention and study. What method does the Christian follow to effect this third stage? Is it proper for the individual to rebel against governmental tyranny, or is it only proper for a lesser magistrate to rebel against a greater magistrate? For example, a state government refusing to submit to the tyranny of the federal government. The instances, he says, when the individual may resist have been discussed, but an appraisal of the legitimacy of general governmental tyranny in relation to individual causes is the most difficult. In other words, what happens when you alone feel like you have an issue? The individual as an individual can only follow the first two steps, petitioning the oppressor or fleeing. When any governmental power demands that the Christian sin, it is the duty of the Christian to disobey the state's demand. The individual does not have to wait for the lesser magistrate to intervene. In other words, you don't have to. If in our system of government, which is still has some vestiges of biblical setup, you do have a federal government which is becoming it now is. It's almost all powerful. There was a day the states gave control to the federal government, but that day has escaped us. But we do have sheriffs and other officials that are vested with authority that can participate when governmental tyranny goes too far. It says, what can the individual do when there is general oppression by the state? For example, oppressive taxation, and the state refuses to listen to the cries of the people, and the people are not able to flee the oppression. The people then have the right to call a halt to the tyranny of the greater magistrate through the duly constituted authority of the lesser magistrate. All right, so in other words, I'm quoting Francis Schaeffer, for a corporate body, civil entity, when illegitimate state acts are perpetrated upon it, resistance should be under the protection of the duly constituted authority. If possible, it should be under the rule of the lesser magistrate. So in other words, if we're reacting, and he gives the example of taxation, you just can't say, Brad Bates just can't say, I'm not paying taxes. All right? What Brad Bates has to do is find those of like mind in order to affect a state, let's say, to be able to say, we will not do this as a state. Now, we see illustrations of this. For instance, healthcare was a part of that whole debate, whether states would accept money with which to implement these things. That was one of the instances that has been as of late. And so the state arose and said, we're not going to do this. Of course, what happens is, and here's the stupidity of our government. We send, through the state, monies to the federal government, who in turn sends it back to us if we'll do certain things. But we're forced to do what they, and it is. It's crazy. All right? The War of Independence is a good example of how lesser magistrates, the American colonies, first petitioned the king for redress of grievances. I will encourage you, if you have never read the Declaration of Independence, has anyone, I'm not putting you on the spot, but if you've never read the Declaration of Independence, find an English version. Don't go to the manual. It's hard to read Old English. But go to modern English, read the Declaration of Independence, and you will see clearly how the American colonies, through that document, began to enumerate through the appeal system how they appealed, with which to finally get to the place that they severed their relationship with the greater magistrate. The original reason for the flight to the colonies was due to oppressive British rule. When there was no response by the king to remedy the situation, the oppressed British subjects fled to the American colonies, but the long arm of English rule remained. When the long-standing oppression became unbearable, the colonies severed their ties with King George III by written declaration. The Declaration of Independence claimed that King George III violated social compacts or charters for the settlement of North America. Within the framework of 18th century English imperial government, was it the right of the people to alter or abolish the British rule and institute a new government? On that question, the Revolutionary War was fought. The Declaration listed a long train of abuses and usurpations in order to bolster the colonies' complaint against the king. The colonies, now listed as independent states, freed themselves from the tyranny of the king. Legitimate governments, the United States of America, separated themselves from an illegitimate government, English rule. All right, and most of you have taken American history, and we won't go through this. Isn't necessarily an American history class. Now, these are just. This is pastor thinking out loud. All right, so I'm not sure I've coalesced all of these thoughts, but this is. there is nowhere to flee. In other words, there's no more geography that you can go to really anymore. So here's the question. What do we do in the 21st century? And these I'm just chewing on things, and so this is some of my thoughts as I've been chewing on this. One has said that the geography of the kingdom is relationship. And I think there's some truth in that. Because the kingdom of God doesn't exist in dirt and soil, it exists in our relationships of those of like faith. That's really what the church is. The church is going to reach a place, I can guarantee you right now, that through either taxation or through litigation, it's going to be really, really challenging to have property rights are going to be challenged. I guess that's the bottom line. Property rights for churches are going to be greatly challenged in the future. I don't know that it'll be our generation. It might be our kids or our grandkids, but it's going to be really, really challenged. Just like it is in Russia or China or anywhere else, it's going to be greatly challenged. So the question becomes, what happens when this kind of pressure is put on, since there's nowhere to flee? What happens when your state governments or your county governments are as corrupt as your federal governments? What can you begin to appeal to in order to follow a biblical pattern? Well, it's when you understand that authority is not just in civil government. Well, where else is authority? No, in earthly institutions. It's not a trick question. Well, in the home or the church, exactly. And this is why it's going to become imperative. And I think one of the reasons, and I hate to say it, but one of the reasons why we're probably going to endure some persecution. We're not just talking about general hostility and adversity, but maybe some persecution, because that's the only thing that's going to press us into a relationship that probably causes us to move out of it. And that is when we understand that the church is still the one entity that can arise, that can challenge these other, under God, that can challenge these other, who were to be or are to be under God as well. But how do you do that right now in America? Man, it's right. See, as long as the church at large is in such absolute compromised position, it's difficult to challenge some of these things on the front end. Because the guy, and I'm not saying it's bad, it's how the human mind works. It's how we work in neighborhoods. You know, if your neighbor down the street is getting hassled for some reason, you know how it works. I mean, it's not my business. If the guy, and maybe not you all would be different, I would be different, I would hope. But someone's getting accosted on a street in New York City, and we have reports of how many people just walk by and say, that's just not my business. Or on a subway, that's just not my business. It happens in the church too. Now, the difference is what's happened in Houston. Have you been keeping up with what's going on in Houston? Do y'all know the story of Houston? Do I need to tell the story? Does everybody know? Not everybody knows the story?
I'd like to hear the correct one.
You like to hear some of the correct? Well, I can tell you because one of the guys I know. Here's what happened. A lesbian mayor was elected. She has served some time now, and she wanted an ordinance that opened up all public restroom facilities for transgender usage, which means men could use women's could use men. It all boiled down to who you felt you were that day. Now that opens up such a can of worms in the public arena that we can't even go. Think about your kids, think about, it just opens up a can that's incredible. So, in order to address this, there were a group of 5 pastors who got together and they funded a poll of Houston citizens to try to determine how many really were for a transgender bathroom or how many were against. 82%, it came back. This is what's interesting to me. 82% of the citizenry in the poll said they were against the transgender bathroom, whereas there was a majority of citizens that didn't mind the lesbian mayor, which is kind of an interesting thing to me right there. I don't even know how to interpret that. But nonetheless, a qualified poll, 82% said they weren't ready for transgender bathrooms. The mayor didn't care. So they decided they would attempt to bring this to referendum. So they went through the appropriate process in the city charter for referendum. It took 17,000 signatures in order to bring it up for a vote. The pastors were able, and others obviously, were able to collect 50,000 signatures. After 30,000 verified signatures were counted, they stopped counting. So they had enough to take it to referendum. The city attorney then decided that he would invalidate all of the signatures. So he invalidated all of the signatures, and the ordinance was pushed through the city council. A citizens group decided they didn't like that, so the citizens group decided to file a lawsuit because they violated the Constitution of the city charter. As soon as they filed the lawsuit, this is Law 101 as I understand it, that the defense, which is now the city, is the defense, okay? Because the citizen group is the one that's litigating it. So under defense procedure, they are able to go through what's called the discovery process, which allows them to subpoena whatever they need in order to bring about an appropriate defense to the lawsuit that was filed by the citizens group. The pastors were not involved in the citizens group. However, the subpoenas were issued to the 5 pastors who initiated all of this with regards to the polling and as well as the accumulation of the signatures. The subpoenas asked for all their sermons, all their text messages, all their emails, all their internal correspondence, anything that the mayor's name was mentioned, the city attorney's name was mentioned, anything about transgenderism, homosexuality, the bathroom ordinance. They wanted everything, all communication related to that, sermons included. Well, there was an uproar that took place, and I don't think they were prepared. The Houston city was not prepared for the uproar. And so supposedly the first report was, well, we're going to back up. You're right, the subpoenas were too broad. So they decided they would retailor them, and the only thing they pulled out was they pulled out the word sermon, and they put in the word speech. That's all they switched. So 5 pastors and churches are being subpoenaed for all of their records. Now think about this. This is text messages, your phones, your computers. Think about, you don't have any idea how much counsel goes on via technology. You have no idea. No idea once you give your technology up. They're into your books, they're into everything. And there's still a First Amendment, which is a wall. Remember, there is a wall. You don't hear much about separation of church and state when the state wants to jump in the church's business, do you? You don't hear that much anymore. Anyway, so this whole thing, it has caused, wonderfully, pastors to arise, and I'd love to see how many Bibles and sermons, because what happened is all over the nation, there are people mailing the Houston mayor their Bible. They wanted sermons, so they're mailing Bibles and sermons to the mayor. I'm sure she was buried with this stuff from all over America. Now, in constitutions. All right. Well, here's the good news. The good news is that maybe there's a tipping point, and you see the church arises, and there's an authority to this. See, even the world starts going, there's an authority to this. They can't define it. And the interesting thing is she really doesn't want to back down. Because what she's processing right now is, well, they really don't have, in her mind, any authority. But what she doesn't understand is her authority wasn't derived from earthly matters. Her authority still comes from God. Of course, in her rebellion, that authority is circumvented. But our authority as well comes from God, and we are legitimate. The church is as a legitimate authority as is civil government. Now, hear me when I say this. I just told you something so controversial. You have no idea how controversial that was. That we as the church have the same exact authority as civil government. That's why if the church could coalesce and arise, You could turn this nation around in 30 days. But here's the problem. We have Christians who are being taught Jesus don't do politics. Jesus doesn't want to get his hands dirty. Jesus didn't say anything about that. Jesus didn't say anything about tripping blind people, so we can trip blind people. That's the theology we're getting. When we have pastors of mega churches say Jesus never said anything about homosexuality, therefore, where did that come from? Jesus never said anything about unicorns. I mean, I could go down the list of things Jesus never talked about. Jesus never talked about your iPhone. Why are you using one? I mean, So, anyway. But, now we're going to get back to how do you have appropriate rebellion? That was my point. Well, when a church, and I'll just go down the list, whether it's locally, countywide, statewide, or nationwide, or globally, determines that there are certain tyrannies and usurpations to their divine right to serve the living God. You can't make me sin. You can't make me marry two people whom God calls an abomination. Now, I'll say it again. I love them. They can go buy a house down the street. They can get yard of the month. And I might vote for them. I'll stop and talk to them. I'll pet their dog. I'll ask how their day is going. We'll talk baseball. What they do behind closed doors, God may not like it, but I could probably go around the neighborhood and probably 9/10 of my neighborhood's doing things behind closed doors God doesn't like. Okay? So I get that. If that's what they want to do, God bless them. Well, He won't bless them. I mean, but God. But my point is, you can't make me marry that. You can't make me do that. Well, they're coming. It's coming. And if you don't understand incrementalism, that first off, it started orientation, and if we're oriented this way, then therefore we can't change. If we can't change, then we should be allowed to pursue happiness and a fulfilled life. And now, if two people are in love and we've redefined love, shouldn't they be able to have the same civil contracts? And now that we have civil contracts, it should be that everybody who performs these ceremonies should have to do it. How can we be told we can't do it? And now the church is saying it can't do it, so we're going to go after the wedding chapels who right now are doing it for profit, even though they're Christian ministers. But once we get into them, we're going to figure out here in a little bit that ministers, when they do weddings, actually sign a piece of paper by the county, and they're functioning as a governmental agent at that moment. I've signed hundreds of these sheets, and at that moment, I'm functioning as a governmental agent. And there's going to be a moment that they're going to look at me and say, you're a governmental agent. You've proved it 100-fold times. And now you're saying you won't do it? We'll see. I'm telling you that you say, well, why won't they go to the pastor down the street who be begging to do it? Because that's not the agenda. You have to understand there's spiritual warfare going on here, as well as this natural hostility. Well, what's going to have to happen? Well, if we don't arise now, for instance, if we decide that Houston isn't worth standing on, then it'll go a little further. And where's the tipping point? So my hope is this is the tipping point. That is why in South Carolina we called a great gathering in Columbia on November the 8th. Ron Johnson is calling one in Indiana. We know that there are people. In fact, on November the 2nd, at the iStand meeting in Houston, Tony Perkins and those guys are going to use these models, and they're going to call for pastors in all 50 states to have these meetings. Now, I know some will go, why should I go? I don't like it, but I don't have the time to go. At what point does the church demonstrate authority? I'll tell you when you wish it would have happened, when they come after you. And they will come after you. Won't they, Amy? They'll come after you.
And I would say, just because this can of worms has been opened recently, I've had them coming out of the woodwork trying to get me to do wedding cakes.
So,
Why would anybody, that was my ding there when you started that. Why would anybody want me when they've got other people to make their
1,000 bakers.
want me who doesn't want to make their cake? I mean, I wouldn't want somebody fixing food for me if they didn't want to be making food for me.
It's a,
Well, that's why I know one particular person who said they were gonna change their ingredients. So I don't know what that meant, but.
well, I don't know either, but you know,
Exactly.
but you see, here's the problem with that isn't, but then even, and you're sued for,
Right.
Food poisoning, yeah.
or for whatever lack of service that should have been demonstrated. So, you know, and I can't answer these questions for every baker or print or t-shirt maker or whatever it may be. Even though I know, just Amy, I put you on the spot, but I know Amy's turned down business of, you know, the girls are having a bridal shower and they're wanting Amy to make cakes that look like private parts of individuals. And they're wanting their cake parts to look like that. Now, I'm looking, I don't know, why would you want to eat that cake? I don't know, I'm just going, you hate to be indelicate, but Amy said, we're not doing this.
Right, and that nobody that I've told them that I won't make a cake like that has complained or sued me, but.
Right, and or a t-shirt printer who would put some egregious thing saying, I'm not printing that. Or do you have to do a Klan rally? Or does a kosher bakery have to do, ham-flavored cake? I don't know. I mean, where does it stop? But here's the bigger question. The bigger question is, when does the church arise?
Yeah, that's right. That is the issue.
When does it arise? Now, I'll go back. I guess when it starts hitting pastors who are right now going, it didn't bother me any. But the church is in a compromised state, and my fear is that we yield. We don't want to speak straight. We don't want to say it. And I'm not saying it unloving or hateful, but we're having a real difficult time these days, looking the media in the eye and just being clear. I mean, I understand there are ways to say things, and you've got your Westboro people, which I think we all know. I mean, nobody's advocating that somehow they're communicating God's ways appropriately. I don't think anybody is remotely there. But there comes a moment that you speak. When someone looks at you and says, "What do you think about this?" You just, well, it's not really what I think about it. It's what God thinks about it. And if you're wanting to know, here, just a couple passages what God says about it. Next question. But we look foolish as we dance around. We look weak. We look tepid. We're reeds blowing in the wind. And so I don't know. I don't know when it happens. So anyway, that's what I muse about late at night. All right, let me see where we're at here. Any other comment or question? This Ted.
Looking at the appropriate rebellion, would you
Yes.
say then that, based on at least what you know at this point, I don't claim to be the expert, though we have an expert, he's just not here. Convention of States, would you say a model like that would fit into appropriate rebellion?
Yes. Well,
That's what we're seeing in the runaway federal level.
Yes. When I heard the first sounds of Convention of States, and I know the John Birchers aren't for it, and other conservative people are for it. I was a little simplistic at the beginning because my view was, if it's in the Constitution, how can you say it's not constitutional? So I know that's pretty simplistic, but it's obviously a lever that was put in there. Now, here's the key. Are the Birchers right that if a bunch of carnal people seize the Convention of the States, we could be in worse shape than we are? Potentially, but again, I go back to the bus illustration. I mean, this thing's pointed in the wrong direction. So let's say in that moment that carnal hearts get a hold of it and do even more damage. So, okay, so instead of going over the cliff at 65, we'll go over the cliff at 100. We're still going over the cliff. But if the church were to arise, do you see what I'm saying? If the church arose at that moment, you could,
Reel everything
but there'd have to be a massive awakening, and I don't know, maybe awakening and something like that could be God's providential means of bringing this nation back to its purposes. But see, whenever God does that, though, it's at tipping points. It's like you read the Bible. Israel was always at tipping points. They always had enemies at their door. It was always, and that makes it very, because we are more like, can't we do this a little more tidy? And no, I mean, apparently not. Unless there's pain, we won't listen to experience. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not a constitutional expert, but I've got no problem with the Convention of States. I just know that if God's people don't arise, that it's all we're going to do is be putting the foot on the accelerator. So, but here's the point, and not to use Steve, but Steve brought it up. I mean, if you have a family member who has violated a law, even if it's a son, daughter, but we want to do everything as parents to help mitigate the repercussion of what they did, because we love them. But there comes a moment, and I'm not saying that at this point we're ejecting from your illustration, but there comes a moment if a child is incorrigible, that all you have left is, and honestly, sometimes your best prayer would be, then God, let it happen quickly. Then there's certain pain that you would just soon have it done quick. It's like pulling a tooth out of your head. I mean, you can sit there and wiggle that thing for weeks and just cause your pain, or you can, it's like my granddad used to do. He put the string on the thing and just, now that hurt, but it was done. So what kind of pain do you want? You want long-term pain, or do you want your pain to be over with? And so when I'm fussing with people or having these conversations and they say, oh, it could be worse, it could deteriorate even faster. Well, it's, what do you say to that? You're just saying, okay, because we aren't hearing it any other way. So, all right. Anything?
When
Yep.
we hear these, I don't want to pick on pastors because it's everyone, but when they dance around their words, let's say like an interview or questioning by someone else, would you say that's just a complete lack of trust that God actually says what He says, or is it?
Robert, there's some layers. I don't know that I can talk for everyone on this. Pastors are human beings too, and you don't want to alienate people. You don't want people not to like you. You don't want to cause upheaval around you. So, and everyone knows that's the minefield. That's why they're asking you the question. It's the minefield. And so for some, it's just, oh, geez, do I really have to go through this minefield? And it could be as simple as that. It's not. It may be, if you could get down to their heart of hearts, they'd say, yeah, it's, they want to say things like, well, it really isn't God's best. Well, of course it's not. I just want to, when I hear it, I go, oh yeah, it's not God's best, obviously. But our natures are different. And sometimes this is the difference for me. I had something really, really big at one time, really large, and I lost it. And once you lose something really, really important and it's gone, and you find out that God's still there and that's all that's really important, and you can still go on and make a difference, then that gives you a place of liberty that you've never had before. And for some guys, they have so much that they're afraid of losing that they're internally scrambling because they don't want to lose it. So, and I understand that. The second layer is, as I said before, is just they're just theologically, they don't have the ability to take the next questions that are coming after that one. Well, what about? Well, what about? Well, what about? And and so they want to navigate that in a nuanced, almost political way. And that, I think to whom much is given, much is required. And I think some of them has let us down. Now, Steve Riggle, who's in Houston, has this it's massive. He's like one of my heroes. This dude has this massive church, and he's just right there, man. He doesn't care. He's right on it. And good for him. Jim Garlow's another one. Good for him. But there's some of them that I just go, can we just not even put them on TV? And just sorry. Steve, sorry.
That's okay. Well, to address that from a viewpoint, I came from a very large church in Greenville, South Carolina, and the pastor there, him and his wife recently have gone through some stuff, and this stuff was brought to his attention years ago. And because of what he had, I saw the internal situations. I think that was his reasoning. I think he didn't want to address certain things because of what he had. And so I hope this is the reason the Lord allowed me to go from that to, I went from a very large church where everybody's jumping up and down in worship and it's young and all this, to a group of 100 people and all had white hair. And they were singing songs from way back, and I'm going, is this for me? No. Are you sure about this, Jesus? But the point is that I think personally, for instance, a lot of these guys, as Pastor Kevin said on TV, a lot of the TV guys I think are just that, and they put that out there. I defend a lot of them though for this reason. I think they're my brothers. I defend them for that position, not for what they say. I've actually spoken out several times. However, the hard part is I think that's why they're doing it. They're doing it because they have so much. And a guy in the denomination I was in recently, a large church, he was giving, he's made some statements, and they're now looking at his board is going to possibly even vote him in or out. And they have the right to do that in that denomination. And so he's facing, I think he's been there over 20 years. He's got a large salary. He's got family, he's got stuff, and I think that's why.
Oh, absolutely.
You can tell, and he's even tried to pull back in some of those statements and go, Abba, and you know that he's doing that strictly because of what he's facing he might lose.
Yeah.
And I think that happens regularly.
So, just picking up on your question, Robert, and it's a valid one, I would say this, but have appropriate compassion as well, because if you were zeroed in on in your workplace, ask yourself the question, would I be as willing to eject? Because it's easy to look at the guy at church and go, well, he ought not compromise, he ought to do this. Well, yeah, but he's paying his bills, and he's putting food on the table, and he's doing this and this and this. Now put yourself in that position, and while you can cheer it or curse it, but remember, if it came down to you, and your job was on the line, it's not always as simple. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean the right thing ought not still be done.
Right.
I'm not suggesting that there's any negotiating at the tables of the enemy. I'm not suggesting that. But these are bridges the church is going to have to, the people are going to have to cross. Because one of these days, as we're all singing on Sunday mornings, Jesus, I trust you, or whatever the song is, oh, I trust you, I trust you, I trust you. Well, okay, that's great in worship theoretically. But there's going to come a moment where that's probably going to be put to the test. Do you really trust him or not? And whether it's a matter of, point one, litigation, point two, fleeing, or arising, any one of those points, I can't answer for everybody. It's still going to take trust. See, if you litigate, you're going to have to trust God that, you come out victorious, because if you don't come out victorious, then you're hammered. If you flee, you're still going to have to trust him, because what are you going to do? I mean, you still got to put food on your table and pay your bills, and so you're following me. I mean, but also follow me in this. 90% of your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ look at this bridge a lot more than you do. All over the world. All over the world. And so that's just not China's lot, or Russia's lot, or the Middle Eastern Christians' lot. But it may well come to ours as well. And I don't want it to. I enjoy America. I enjoy the liberty. I want to maintain our liberty so we can keep doing the priority without the adversity. I'd love to. I'm doing everything I can. But there are others who don't seem to think it's going to change. And I think they're being foolish. So I'm trying to be nicer. Every now and then the Holy Spirit will work with me and just go, you need to be nicer. Okay, Lord, I won't challenge these people. And so Steve, kind of like you, I'm not, I want to call him brother. I just wish they'd use their influence for more than their next book deal.
Amen.
All right, you're a multi-gazillionaire. How many millions do you need? I mean, what more do you need? My God, the last book you made $15 million off the last book that wasn't the first 3 books you wrote. And now you can't stand and help us out? How much more do you need? That's kind of where I am. I mean, the guys who are fighting this battle are trying to figure out, most of them are trying to figure out, if they live to 80 years old, how are they going to keep paying their bills? And their answer is, I guess I'm going to trust God. That's their answer. That's who's fighting this battle. You know who's fighting this battle? Who's fighting this battle are the guys who month to month are hoping all their money pays their bills. And they've got their kids in school or whatever. Those are the guys. It's not just me. I can go across the board. I can tell you the guys who are fighting the battle. They've got absolutely nothing in the bank, and their backs are against the wall, and they're the ones that are out front. And so that's why every now and then I get this little surly spirit. And I said, why can't you help? Why can't you stand up? You're speaking to millions of people every week on your satellites and your cable TVs and your televisions and your radio, and you can't say a word to even help. See, now you're hearing how it looks behind the scenes at my house. Because here's the deal. Well, I won't tell you. Well, the deal is, if this nation turns around, every mega pastor ought to go to every small church that stood up in this battle when it's all said and done. And I won't tell you what they need to do, but they need to thank them, because they'll be the heroes that'll keep them doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
See, but I'll be nicer when I go home now, see? All right.
But this is going to be online, so.
Yeah.
We just sent it to Dave. Just for your.
Save it for Columbia.
But it does concern me. I got a grandbaby. If little Jude lives, if Jude, and I believe he will. I believe honestly. I mean, I know his dad won't, but I honestly believe there's a 3rd generation pastor, preacher that's sitting in that car carrier right there. 3rd generation. I believe that. And he's going to face things that I'm talking about right here, and it's real. If it doesn't change, it's real. He'll either be underground or fined out of existence, or he'll be in jail. And he's going to stand over my grave and say, Granddaddy, when you could have changed it, why didn't you change it? Why didn't you do something? That won't be his report that he'll have to take. And it's just, and so it is that level of burden. I don't know why I see it. I think you see it. I think, of course, our church, this church catches my DNA. So if you don't see it, you're really hard-headed because you hear it from me all the time. But they're just clueless. People they're walking around Christians are just oblivious, and they're just clueless. Have a lady I'm going to talk to this week, has 20,000, she's got an internet radio broadcast of which supposedly there's 20,000 listeners. And I don't deny that because I've watched and heard some of those things. And she was telling me the other day on the phone, she goes, I want you to know when you talk to these people, and most of them are believers, they are clueless to what's going on right now in Houston. They are clueless to all of these things. And I'm going, 20,000 people and they're clueless. When I knew it took 6 pastors, all it took was 6 pastors to get a bill to a subcommittee. 6 is all it took. All right. And that's why when God, when we're judged, that's why it's just so obvious to me. God will just say it was obvious. The truth will testify to itself. Well, why don't we take a break? All right, when we come back, we'll do our last 50 minutes.